Our sermon passage today will be found in the book of Ecclesiastes. I will be reading Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 to 13. Please turn there in their Bibles and follow along with me as I read. Please stand for the reading of God's word. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. You may be seated.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, we are continuing our sermon series in the book of Ecclesiastes together this morning, and as we do, we come to one of the more familiar passages in this book, specifically the first 8 verses of chapter 3 here, and then parts of verse 11 as well have been used for everything from funerals to anti-war protests to inspirational coffee mugs. Like they've been song lyrics for the Byrds, for those of you who are old enough to know who they are. And that song has been stuck in my head all week. And more recently for Rebecca St. James, for those of you who are old enough to know who she is. There's something about the idea, though, that for everything there's a season and a time for every matter under heaven, and that God has made everything beautiful in its time, and he has put eternity into man's heart. There's something about those things that resonates with us and feels encouraging and hopeful to some extent, whether you're a Christian or not, from some of the ways that these passages and these verses have been used. And we can understand why, right? Like as we come in here this morning and as we read through this list in verses 2 through 8 here, like you can find yourself here in this list. Like probably multiple places in this list. Like we always have a number of families experiencing the time for being born in our church, it seems like. Or maybe you're weeping and mourning as you come in here this morning. I know there's always some in that category. Maybe you're on the other side of that, though. Maybe you're in the laughing and dancing category this morning. Or maybe you're planting or building, either literally or metaphorically. Maybe you're breaking down or casting away in one way or another. Like maybe you're here today because you really need someone to talk to. Or maybe you're in a place where all you can do right now is keep silent. Like even the places in this list that like you're not there right now, you've probably been there before. And you know what that's like. And in a lot of ways, just because you're not there right now doesn't mean that you won't be there tomorrow or before the end of the year. And so, like as we read through this, we know that our lives are made up of these times and seasons like the list here in verses 2 through 8. And more times and seasons beyond this list. Like it's not meant to be exhaustive. It just represents the different pieces of time that make up our lives. And so what this passage does for us then, and this is why it resonates with us so much, is that it gives us hope that there's a way to put all of these pieces together into something meaningful, like something that makes sense. And so in a lot of ways, our lives can feel like someone just dumped a whole bunch of puzzle pieces or Lego pieces out on the floor with no instructions, and we're supposed to put them together to make something out of them. And the reality in that is, like, some of those pieces are hard. Like, they're messy and painful and complicated. Like, what in the world do you do with that piece? And so the question in that illustration is whether our lives are more like a Lego set where there is a specific thing that those pieces go together to build, but the pieces are also made in such a way that you can be creative and make whatever you want to make out of those pieces. Or are our lives more like a puzzle where there's really only one way that the pieces are meant to go together, and if we try to make something else out of those pieces, it's not really going to work? Or honestly, are we even the ones that get to put the pieces together at all? Like, do you ever feel that way as you look at the pieces dumped out on the floor in front of you in your life? Like what are you supposed to do with all this? Like, what does it look like to be faithful with what's in front of you? Is there even anything you can do that's worth doing? I mean, like, that's what Solomon has been wrestling with so far in this book, right? Like, if you remember, we've seen how Solomon is looking at life under the sun, like life here and now in this fallen world that we live in on this side of Genesis 3. And his assessment so far is it's all a breath. It's all a mist. It's all a vapor. Like, it's real. It's there. You can see it and you can feel it, but you can't grasp it. Like, you can't get a hold of it or control it or fully understand it. And we've seen over the last few weeks that this isn't just theoretical for him. Like, he's tested this out. Like, he's tested whether wisdom or pleasure, like getting as much knowledge as you can or getting as much stuff as you can bring any lasting gain in this life under the sun. Like, he's gone as far as any human can possibly go down each of those roads. He's basically like recreated the Garden of Eden for himself. And what has he found in all this? He says it's all like trying to shepherd the wind. It's all trying to control the uncontrollable and grasp the ungraspable. And so how has he responded so far? Well, saw last week toward the end of chapter 2 that initially led him to despair, right? Like, it led him to question, what's the point of all this? What's the point in anything that he's done? Ultimately, is there anything worth doing here and now in this life? At the very end of chapter 2 last week, we saw the first glimmer of hope that there are things that are worth doing under the sun, in spite of everything being a breath. And here in chapter 3, he's going to press into that idea a little bit more. Like, what we're going to see here in chapter 3, Solomon's going to take a step back from the experiments that he's been conducting and look at life a little more broadly. And then from that, he's going to draw a couple of lessons that should shape how we respond and how we live life in this world where everything that we've seen so far in this book is true. And so you can see on your handout then where we're headed this morning. First, we're going to look at this kind of zoomed out perspective on life in first 8 verses of chapter 3. And we're going to talk about 3 observations then from the cycles of times that make up our lives here and now, from this pattern of different times of life that we see in those verses. And then from that, we're going to talk about 2 main lessons that Solomon specifically tells us that he intends for us to take away from those observations then. And we'll see that in verses 9 through 11. And then we'll see how Solomon says that we ought to live in light of these cycles of life. Like, what should we do if it's true that this life is, if this is what life is like here and now? We'll see that in verses 12 and 13. And so I hope that if you haven't already been seeing yet in this sermon series, I hope that this passage is where you begin to see that the reality that everything in life is ungraspable isn't discouraging and depressing way to look at life. Like, it actually sets you free. It puts everything into its proper perspective so that you can live this life now and know what to do with the pieces of your life in a way that fits with what God is doing, not just here and now, but beyond the here and now as well. And so look with me first then at chapter 3, verses 1 to 8. Let's talk about these 3 observations then about the cycles of time that make up our lives. So 3 observations about the cycles of time that make up our lives. The first observation then is this. It's that all of life is made up of cycles of times. All of life is made up of cycles of times. We see this a couple different ways here in these first 8 verses of chapter 3. And so if you notice, there's actually kind of 2 main parts to this. You can even see it just in how it's formatted there in your Bible. First, verse 1 is a thesis statement. And then verses 2 through 8 are a poem that unpack and flesh out the thesis statement then that Solomon makes in verse 1. And so in one sense, both parts of this section here are making this one main point, that all of life is made up of cycles of times. And so look first at how Solomon says it in verse 1. He says this, he says, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven." And so his thesis statement here has 2 phrases that each say the same thing in slightly different words and in reverse order. You see that there? So he says, "for everything," which is parallel to "for every matter under heaven" at the end of the verse. And then "season" and "time" in the middle are parallel as well. And so if we focus on the outer part first, the word for matter there in that second phrase is referring to the activities of life, which we'll see examples of the types of matters or activities of life that he has in mind when we get to verses 2 through 8 here in just a minute. The under heaven there is another way to say under the sun, the phrase that we've already seen over and over throughout the book, and we're going to continue to see it, refers to life here and now in this fallen world that we live in. And so his point here then is pretty straightforward. Like everything and every matter under heaven includes like everything, right? Like every activity that makes up our lives here and now. Which means that the list of activities in verses 2 through 8 isn't exhaustive in itself, but it's meant to be representative of everything. Any activity that you can think of fits within the principle that he's laying out here. So then if you look at the middle of the thesis statement, what he's saying about all the activities of life is that there is a season or a time for each of them. And so those 2 words, season and time, mostly mean the same thing, but there's a slight nuance to them that's helpful to see. Like the word season there emphasizes more the idea of an appointed time, where the word time emphasizes more the idea of a specific point in time. So appointed time and point in time. And so that second word there, the point in time, is the one that gets repeated over and over again then in verses 2 through 8. But the word season, I think, helps us not misunderstand that he's not only talking here about just random moments of time where these events happen to take place. He's talking about seasons of life where these activities are designated and even predetermined to take place. So the point in all that then, in this opening statement here in verse 1, is that this life here and now is made up of times or seasons for every kind of activity. And then that's what we see then fleshed out in the poem then in verses 2 through 8. So look there with me. Again, verse 1 says, "For everything there's a season and a time for every matter under heaven." And then he unpacks it here starting in verse 2. "A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." And so we could go through all of these different activities then that he talks about here and analyze each one, but the reality is they're all pretty much what they sound like here. And the thing is, the activities themselves in these verses aren't necessarily the point in the verses. It's the pattern or the cycle of what's happening here in these verses that we need to pay attention to. Like, that's where the observations that we need to see come from. And so first, notice that verses 2 through 8 include 28 different activities if you go through and count them. There's 2 per line, and there's 14 lines. And so the 2 in each line go together, right? Like birth and death, planting and plucking up, killing and healing, breaking down and building up. And so we'll come back to this again in a minute when we get to our next observations, but notice how the 2 in each line represent a cycle, like birth to death, planting to harvest, and so on. It's not just a random list of activities, 28 different activities. It's an organized list of cycles of activities that make up our lives. And not only that, if you look at those pairs of activities a little more closely, what you'll notice is that the 2 lines in each verse has 2 lines, and the 2 lines in each verse are actually parallel to each other as well. So in verse 2 there, you have birth and death, and then you have planting and plucking up what's planted. So do you see how those are more or less parallel? You got the beginning and end of human life, and then you have the beginning and end of plant life, basically. You see the same thing in verse 3. There's a time to kill and a time to heal, which is parallel to breaking down and building up. Like one destroys, the other restores. And so if you went through all of these, you'd see the same thing. Some of them are not as clear as others. It's a little harder to see what the parallel is, but it seems like each verse is meant to be 2 parallel pairs. And so what that means then, if you do the math on all this, is that you end up with 14 lines of this poem forming 7 pairs of parallel pairs, if you're tracking with me. And why that's important is because if you remember back from when we went through Revelation together, the number 7 is important in the Bible, right? Like it represents fullness or completion. And so having then 7 pairs or 2 times 7 doubles down on that symbolism here. And so while the list of activities in verses 2 through 8 isn't meant to be exhaustive in one sense, there are many more activities that you could think of that are part of our lives than the 28 things that are mentioned here. But by putting them in these 7 pairs of pairs, we're supposed to see this list as representing the fullness or totality of life. Like it represents everything and every activity, just like verse 1 says. So then the way these pairs are structured, what we're supposed to see there is that the fullness of life is made up then of these cycles of activities going back and forth and round and round. And so again, the emphasis is less on the activities themselves than it is on the time for each of these activities. The point is that there's an appointed time and an appropriate time, appropriate point in time even, in our lives for each of these things. Like that's why the word time is repeated over and over and over through these verses, 28 times through these 7 verses. And so if you read the list out loud or listen to when Sarah read it or when I read it just a second ago, it almost, you can pick up that repetition of time almost sounds like a ticking clock, right? Time, 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 just over and over and over again. And so the emphasis lands there. And so putting all that together, like, do you see the first observation then in these verses? Like all of life is made up of cycles of different times, from birth to death, and every season and every time in between. The pieces that make up our lives are appointed times and points in time for all the different activities of life. But that's not the only observation for us to pick up on here in these verses. Notice as well, next observation is this. It's that the times of life are a mixture of highs and lows, ups and downs, pluses and minuses. So hopefully that's fairly obvious reading through this list, right? Like when you look at each of the set of activities in verses 2 through 8, what do you notice comparing them to each other? Verse 2, you have birth and you have death. And you have planting, you have plucking up. Verse 3, you've got killing and healing, breaking down and building up. Verse 4, weeping and laughing, mourning and dancing. And so in each set, and you can keep going, there's one activity that we would put in the category of being a more positive thing, and one activity that we would put in the category of being a more negative thing, right? Like one is a plus and the other is a minus. Like if you go down through the list and actually write a little plus over the one and a minus over the other in each line, you can do it pretty quickly. It's pretty easy to say for most of these which one is the plus and which one is the minus. And if you do that, and you'll notice there's one of each in each line. Like sometimes the plus is first and the minus is second, and sometimes it's the other way around. The minus is first and the plus is second, but there's always one of each. And I think that's the point. Like, it's not just that all of life is made up of cycles of times. It's that the cycles of times in this life are a mixture of highs and lows, of ups and downs, of pluses and minuses. And we all know that, right? Like, there are times in our lives that are definitely pluses. Like days and even extended periods of time that are good and sweet, and we feel the kindness and blessing of God, like summer break, summer vacation, friendships, good meal, like babies being born, church picnics. Like there's lots of good times and lots of good seasons in this life. But then there's other times and other extended seasons that are minuses, right? Like days and even years that are hard and sad and confusing, like sickness, broken relationships, losing your job, like things breaking around your house, cancer diagnosis, and the list goes on and on. Like there's lots of low times and seasons in this life as well. And if we don't understand this or remember this, like this is where frustration can settle in this life. Like we want this life to be all pluses, but it's not. It's not all minuses either, though. Like one author said it this way: the list here in verses 2 through 8 isn't all bad, but it's only half good. And the point is, that's what life is like. Life here and now, life under the sun on this side of the fall is a mixture of both. It's a mixture of pluses and minuses. Like that's the second observation here from verses 1 through 8, which leads then into the third observation. The third observation is this: it's that the different times of life offset each other. So do you pick up on that as well as we're going through this list? Like the point is not only that all of life is made up of cycles of times, or that the times of life are a mixture of pluses and minuses. It's that the pluses and minuses completely offset each other, right? Like did you notice that as we looked at some of the different sets of times in verses 2 through 8? It's not only that one is a plus and the other is a minus. Like they're opposite ends of the spectrum, or opposite ends of the pendulum, like birth and death. Planting, plucking up, killing, healing, breaking down, building up, weeping, laughing, all through the list. Like the poem isn't just shaped by the ticking of the clock and the repetition of the word time. Like it's shaped by the back and forth of the pendulum, like the arm of the grandfather clock swinging back and forth. And the thing is, those opposite ends of the pendulum offset each other, right? Like they cancel each other out. And so in some ways that can be a more positive thing, like building up, offsetting, breaking down, laughing, offsetting, weeping. Other times though, like that's a really heavy thought, like plucking up, offsetting, planting, death, offsetting, being born. Either way, whether the offset feels more positive or negative, the end result is the same. One offsets the other. One cancels out the other. Life really is a cycle. Like you end up back where you started. Like that's the picture of life under the sun that these verses paint for us. And so do you see how all these observations fit together? Like the point of verses 1 to 8 is that all of life is made up of these cycles of times. And the reality is that those cycles of times are a mixture of pluses and minuses that offset each other, which kind of sounds like everything else that we've seen so far in Ecclesiastes, right? Like, and leaves us with similar questions that we've been asking along the way. Like what do we do with this? What lessons are we supposed to take away from this perspective on life here and now? And what difference is this supposed to make on how we actually live? Like, how should we live this life if all of this is true? Well, the good news is the author of Ecclesiastes is going to give us some answers to those questions in the next verses. Like he's going to tell us his own conclusions based on these observations in verses 9 through 11. And then he's going to tell us what he's learned about how to live in light of these realities in verses 12 and 13. So let's look at that next. Look next then at two main lessons that we should take away from these observations. Two main lessons we should take away from these observations. And so this is where it's really important to not disconnect verses 1 through 8 from the rest of chapter 3, really. We're only going to look at part of it this week, but it all flows out of verses 1 through 8. And so it might initially look like verse 9 when you're just reading through this. It might look like verse 9 is unrelated or changing topics, but it's actually not. It's actually the first lesson for us to take away from what we've seen so far. And it's this. You can see this on your handout. It's that because life is made up of these cycles of times, there's no lasting gain in anything that we do. So look with me at verse 9 and we'll see this. The question Solomon asks in light of verses 1 through 8 is this in verse 9. What gain has the worker from his toil? And so that question ought to sound familiar, right? It's almost exactly the same question from back at the beginning of the book in chapter 1, verse 3. And so this same question came on the front end of a poem then about the cycles of life in chapter 1. And now it comes at the end of another poem about the cycles of life. And in both cases, the question is the point of the poems. You see that? Like the point is, if all of life is a cycle of times that are a mixture of pluses and minuses and ultimately offset each other, then the reality is that ultimately life is a zero-sum game. Like, we want to live this life like it's about making the line on the profit chart go up as much as possible over the course of our lives. But the reality is that's not how life works. Like, it might feel like the line is going up in certain seasons of life, which is nice, and you feel like you're starting to see some sort of gain from the work that you're putting in. But what verses 1 to 8 say is that it's only a matter of time until the pendulum swings back the other way and undoes everything that might have looked like gain, and then you're right back where you started. Here's how one author puts it. This is really good. He says, given enough time, time will take back all it gives. Every blessing time brings will eventually make way for burden. Time runs in only one direction, but it gives and takes equally. All its gifts are loans. Each of time's good gifts gets shoved off the shelf by its opposite. In all time's changes, the constant is the balance sheet's relentless homing in on zero. No profit stays put for long. Every action will sometime meet its equal and opposite. Once time finishes, your final balance will perfectly match the zero you started with. Like, do you see it? Like, there is no lasting gain in anything we do if this is what life is like. And that's the point of everything that we've seen so far in Ecclesiastes. And this chapter is no different. The thing is, that's not meant to be discouraging or depressing. Like, it's meant to be honest, and it's meant to rescue you from living like this life works that way, from living this life in a way that will ultimately leave you frustrated and empty, because that's not how it works. Like, what will actually discourage and depress you is to try to live this life as if you can get any sort of lasting gain out of it. Like, that's Solomon's point so far. It's what we've already seen over and over in this book. It's what we're going to continue to see the rest of the way. And so that's the first lesson that we're supposed to take away here from verses 1 to 8 again. That because life is made up of these cycles of times, the reality is there's no lasting gain then in anything that we do. So the question then is, should we just throw our hands in the air and give up then? Should we even bother doing anything? If there's no lasting gain in anything we do, is there any point in doing anything in this life? Well, this is where the other lesson that we're supposed to take away from verses 1 to 8 comes in. And this is where the encouragement and the hope begin to come in here in this passage as well. And so the second lesson is this. You can see this on your handout. It's that these cycles of times teach us that there is a sense in which we are workers in this life, but there's another ultimate worker. You see that teaches us that there's a sense in which we're workers in this life, but there's another ultimate worker. Like that's the point of verses 10 and 11. And so at first glance, verses 10 and 11 kind of sound like at least 3, if not 4, kind of separate, disconnected statements. But I don't think that they're meant to be separate or disconnected at all. Like I think they go together to make this point, which is ultimately the answer to the question in verse 9. And so to see this, first thing you need to do is see that the thread that connects all of verses really 9 to 13 here and even into the rest of the chapter, but that's for next week, 9 to 13 specifically, the thread that connects them all together is the idea of work that's woven through these verses. And so there's 3 main words in this section that are related to work. And so you've got the word worker that we've already seen in verse 9. What gain has the worker in his toil, which that's referring to the human worker. And the word there is kind of a general word for work or effort of some sort, of making something or doing something. And so that same word then is used 3 more times in this passage, but it's translated as other words in English. So the word made in verse 11 is the same word as worker in verse 9. So it's saying that he, God, has made or worked all things together, and so all things beautiful in its time. And so we'll talk about that more in a second. Talking about God's work, though, in verse 11. And then a little later in verse 11, it's the same word again when it says that we cannot find out what God has done. We cannot find out what God has worked. And then again in verse 12, when Solomon tells us to do good, the word do there is the same word. So you could say work good. And so 4 times you've got that word for work through this passage. Then you've got the word toil, which is another word for work. Talked about this word back in chapter 1, how it emphasizes the effort and the labor and even the strain and the struggle that we put into the various activities of life in this world. And so that word comes up at the end of verse 9 and then again near the end of verse 13. And then you've got the word business or busy. It's the same word, basically, both of those places, that comes up twice in verse 10. We saw that word back in chapter 1, verse 13, where we're told that it's an unhappy business or a burdensome, painful task that God has given us to be busy with. And so we'll talk more about verse 10 in a minute. But the point for now is that the thread that connects this whole section, all these verses together, is this idea of work and doing, which again makes sense, right? Like that's the question that we're left asking after everything we've seen so far. Like if every time or season of life ultimately offsets, like is there any point in anything that we do? Is there any point in our work? Like those are the questions then that Solomon's answering here in these verses. And the answer comes by looking at both our work and at God's work then, and how the two are related. And so that's what we see then as we go through verses 10 and 11. So first in verse 10 is we see this. See that there are things that God has given us to do. There are things that God has given us to do. Look with me at verse 10. Solomon says, I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. So the first part of Solomon's answer to the question in verse 9 of what gain we have in all our toil is that he's seen the business that God has given us to be busy with. And so again, this is a very similar statement in a lot of ways to chapter 1, verse 13. Kind of mentioned that a second ago. The difference is in chapter 1, Solomon called it an unhappy business, a burdensome, painful task. But here he doesn't call it an unhappy business. He just calls it a business. A task. And so to answer the question, what gain is there in all our toil, is not to just give up and not do anything. It's first to recognize that there are things that God has given us to do. Like there is a sense in which we are workers, like in verse 9, and God has given us tasks to do. Like in a lot of ways, that's what's implied in the cycles of times in verses 2 through 8. Like if there is a time for planting or plucking up what is planted, like it's implied that we should be doing that activity, like planting or plucking up what is planted in the time that it's appropriate to be doing that. If there's times for breaking down and building up, then the implication is that God intends for us to do those things in those seasons. And again, if the cycles of times in verses 2 through 8 are meant to represent all of life, then the implication is that God has given us things to do in every time and every season of life. Whatever season or time we find ourselves in, God has given us things to do, like whether that's our different jobs that we get paid to do, or whether that's different routine things like taking care of our bodies or our homes or our families, whether that's pursuing different relationships or taking care of our kids or studying in school or whatever it is. Like there's a sense in which we're all workers in that way, and there are things that God has given each of us to do in the different times and seasons of life that we find ourselves in. So in a lot of ways, that's the biblical definition of wisdom. Like Ecclesiastes is a wisdom book, and the point is learning to recognize what time or season you're in and doing what you ought to do in that time or season of life. God has set things up that way, that he's given us things to do that are right and appropriate in the different times and seasons of life. That's the point there in verse 10. But that leads us into the next point that we see in verse 11, and it's this. It's that God is the one who actually makes everything fitting and right in its time. Look what Solomon says next there in verse 11. He says this. He says, he, which is God here, has made everything beautiful in its time. So again, the word made there is the same word as the human worker in verse 9. So the point is that we're not the only worker at work in this life. God is also at work. And look then at what God is doing. And so the thing is, the word beautiful there, like this is a familiar verse. We know this. Again, songs and everything that are made from this verse, and the word beautiful there is fine. It's not a bad translation of it, but in this context, probably what it means is not so much focusing on like the aesthetic beauty of something, but it being fitting or right is the point. So what Solomon is saying is that God has made everything fitting or right in its time. And the everything here that he has made fitting or right is all the different activities in verses 2 through 8. So the point is, we're not the one then who makes all of those activities fitting and right in their time. Like God is. The reality is we don't have any control over the times and seasons of our lives. Only God does. Our job isn't to make all the pieces and times and seasons of our lives fit together. Like we don't get to decide what time it is. That's God's job. And he's perfect at it. Not only is he able to, but it says he has made everything that he brings into our lives fitting and right in its time. Like it's not a question of whether that will happen. Like it's a done deal. So the thing is, you look at the list in verses 2 through 8 again, and it's easy to question how some of those things could ever be fitting or right. I mean, again, there's a minus in every one of those lines, like killing, weeping, mourning, losing, hating, war, dying. Like, how is it possible? How can he say that God makes everything fitting and right in its time? Like, how's there ever a time that any of those things are fitting and right? Well, that's what Solomon addresses then in the rest of verse 11. That's the third point that we need to see here, and it's this. It's that God has given us a sense that he's doing something bigger than we can see right now, but we can't fully grasp everything that he's doing. He's given us a sense that he's doing something bigger than we can see right now, but we can't fully grasp everything that he's doing. And so stay with me here. Like this is Solomon's point in the rest of verse 11 if you track what he says here. And so look at what he says. He says, also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. And so there's kind of two parts to this. First, he says that God has put eternity into man's heart. So what does that mean? Well, to some extent, I think it's exactly what we feel when we ask the question that we just asked a minute ago. Like, even though we are creatures who dwell in time and whose lives are made up of cycles of times, there's something in us that feels the tension in these cycles of times that make up our lives and that knows there has to be something more to life than these cycles that just cancel each other out. Like if this life is all there is, there's no way for weeping and mourning and losing and dying to make sense and to be fitting and right. Like the only way for those things to be made right is if there's something more than this time-bound life. And it's not just that we feel that tension, it's that we long to break free of these cycles of times that make up our lives here and now. Like we feel like we were made for something more than this. Like, here's how C.S. Lewis describes this sense. He says, most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never quite keep their promise. He says, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Like Solomon is saying that. He's saying that sense of eternity that we all feel was actually placed into our hearts by God. But here's the thing. He says God placed eternity in our hearts. Like he's given us that sense. But look at the rest of verse 11 again. Yet, or but, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Meaning, like God has given us some sense that there must be more to this life than this, that we were made for something more than this. But he doesn't give us the ability to figure out everything that he has done. And again, that's the word for work again. He doesn't give us the ability to figure out his work from beginning to end. Like we want to be able to see how all the pieces fit together and be fitting and right. Like we want to know that. We want to be able to see it and even to some extent to be able to control it and do it ourselves. But God doesn't give us the ability to figure it out or to make sense of it all or to make it fitting and right ourselves. Like he's given us a big, important sense and longing for eternity, but not a full understanding of everything that he's done from beginning to end. And so here's the thing, like we are in a little bit different position here this morning than Solomon was when he wrote Ecclesiastes, right? Like we have this book. Like we have the whole Bible. Like God not only placed eternity in our hearts, he gave us a book that tells us a whole lot more about eternity, right? Like the Bible tells us that we really were made for something more than this life here and now in this fallen world that we live in. Like we were made for eternity with God. But we lost that eternity when Adam and Eve rebelled against God in the garden back in Genesis 3. But in God's kindness and mercy, he didn't just leave us to ourselves to suffer the consequences of our sin in this fallen world, like the cycles of time that ultimately end in death, and that's just our lot in life. That's the end of the story. No, like he sent his son who entered this time-bound world as a human, lived the perfect life that we failed to live, and then went to the cross and took the death that we deserve. And then he didn't stay dead. He rose from the dead as the firstborn of a new creation and broke down the wall between time and eternity. And so now we can be set free from the cycles of time that end in death by trusting in Jesus, by repenting and trusting in Jesus. We can be united with him by faith so that we will dwell with him in eternity after he returns and fully and finally breaks the cycles of time when he returns and establishes his kingdom. And so for those of us that's true of us, that we have repented and trusted in him, that changes everything about how we live and the perspective that we have on life right now. If you're here this morning, though, and that's not you, this is the first piece. Like your life isn't going to make sense. A lot of the things that we're talking about right now aren't going to be true of you and aren't going to make sense until you understand this. And so this is the first step. And if that's you, really glad that you're here. Would love to talk to you more about this. But that's the perspective shift that has to happen first. That's the change that has to happen first for anything else that we're talking about to make sense. The thing is, though, that in going back to where we picked up or where we left off here in Ecclesiastes 3, God has given us a lot more that we can know about eternity than just the sense of it and the longing for it that we all have in our hearts. He's given us more details than that in the Bible. But even still, even with all that, Even with all that God has revealed to us about eternity in the Bible, he hasn't given us the ability to understand and make sense of everything that he's done or everything that he is doing day by day and moment by moment, even if we do know the big picture and even if we do know the end of the story. So the reality is there's a lot of things in this life, a lot of cycles of times that we experience that we don't understand and that we can't grasp what God is doing. And the point is, God has done that on purpose. And so we'll talk more about why next week, but in a lot of ways, the point is that he's God and we're not. Like, he's the one that makes everything fitting and right in its time, whether we see it or not, and whether we understand it or not. Like, he doesn't have to explain everything to us. We have to trust that he knows what he's doing and that he's made everything fitting and right now, and that he will make it everything fitting and right in the end. That's the point here in verse 11. And so putting all that together, do you see the lesson then in verses 10 and 11? Like, the lesson is that the cycles of time that make up our lives teach us that there is a sense in which we are workers. There are things that God has given us to do. No, there's not lasting gain in anything that we do here in this life, but there's another ultimate worker. He's the one that makes everything fitting and right in its time, whether we see how or understand how or not. And so the question then is, like, how should we respond to all that? Like, if all that's true, how should we live our lives day to day, here and now? And that's the question that we want to wrap up our time with. And you can see this next on your handout. How should we live? How we should live in light of the cycles of life? So the good news is Solomon tells us that in our last two verses. And so look at verses 12 and 13 with me. Solomon says this. He says, I perceived, and that word there means that Solomon learned this, and now he knows it to be true. Like, he's not guessing about this. Like, he knows. He knows this. He knows that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. So Solomon says that, like, in light of everything we've talked about this morning, the best things that we can do are these things. Number one, he says there's nothing better for us than to be joyful. Be joyful. And again, I said this earlier, but Ecclesiastes isn't meant to leave us disappointed and discouraged that there's no lasting gain in this life. It's meant to set us free, to live joyfully here and now. And do you see how the perspective that chapter 3 gives us does that? Like, it's true that there's no lasting gain in anything that we do, but that's not what our work is meant for. It's not about accumulating lasting gain for ourselves. It's about doing what God has given us to do because he's the ultimate worker and he has made everything, every activity that makes up our lives, he's made it all fitting and right in its time. Like that should fire us up and produce joy in our lives day to day that in one sense nothing can touch. Like, that doesn't mean, though, that we should just put on a smiley face all the time and just act like we're happy all the time. Like, it doesn't mean that there aren't times in our lives that hurt or times in our lives that are sad. Again, going back to verses 2 through 8, there's a time to mourn and a time to weep. Like, there's a time in life for lament. But the biblical pattern of lament moves from bringing our questions to God to turning to trust him and praise him, even while there may still be tears on our faces. Like, it's Habakkuk 3:17 and 18. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Or Psalm 13, crying out, how long, O Lord, about all the different things that we're suffering in this life. How long, O Lord, over and over, and still being able to say by verse 5, but I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Like, that's the perspective that this chapter gives us on life so that we can respond even in the hard seasons of life, even in the hard times of life, by being joyful. And so we may not always be smiling, but the problem here, the opposite of what he's talking about here, is that if rather than being joyful, we grumble and complain. Like, how often is that what characterizes you? Like, this has been convicting for me this week. Like, that's what characterized Israel in the Old Testament. Like, why did they grumble and complain all the time? Because they didn't trust that God had made everything right in its time. Like, they wanted to be in control and do things their own way. Like, grumbling and complaining reveals a heart that doesn't trust the ultimate worker. But if we trust that God has made everything fitting and right in its time, then we can be joyful no matter what season or time that we find ourselves in. Like, that's the first way Solomon says we should live, is be joyful. Second, he says there's nothing better for us to do than to do good. And so again, the word do here is the same word for work that connects these verses together. So in a sense, the point here is that God has given us things to do in this life, like we talked about. And again, in connection with the times and seasons in verses 2 through 8, what that's talking about specifically is that he's given us activities to do that are appropriate to do in the different times that make up our lives. And so the point here is to do what's good, to do what's right, to do whatever is fitting and right in the time of life that you're in right now. Like, that's how we should live. And Solomon says that we should do both of these things, that we should be joyful and do good as long as we live. Like, those two things ought to be the pattern of our lives here and now. But he doesn't stop there. He says also that everyone should do these things as well. He says, number 3, he says we should eat and drink. And so this comes up 4 different times in Ecclesiastes. 4 different times Solomon tells us that this is what we should do. And so here's the thing with eating and drinking. Like, on one hand, they're both things that you have to do, right? Like, to stay alive, you need to eat and drink fairly regularly. Like, most of us eat and drink multiple times a day. Like, yeah, if things are going well, then you eat several times a day. You drink a lot throughout the day, right? But not only are eating and drinking necessary, they're not only things that represent like the routine things that we do to take care of ourselves and stay alive, they're also pretty enjoyable, right? Like, just think about it. Like, God didn't have to make these things that we have to do every day to stay alive enjoyable to do, but he did. Like, he made food taste good. And he gave us all kinds of varieties of food to enjoy. Like, how incredible is that? But think about how food and drink are also a picture of what we've seen throughout this passage and throughout this book as well, right? Like, is there any lasting gain in eating and drinking? Like, not really. Like, when you eat and drink, you'll feel full and not thirsty for a little while, but eventually you're going to get hungry and thirsty again. So, like, does that mean that we should just stop eating and drinking? Like, what's the point if you're just going to be hungry and thirsty again, right? If you just have to do it again in a few hours, like, what's the point? Like, no. Like, we keep doing it because that's how God designed us. Again, he made it enjoyable even for us to do what he's designed us to do in this way. And so in light of everything that we've seen this morning, one of the best things that we can do is to eat and drink, to do the routine things that we need to do, to live for however long that we'll live, and enjoy doing them. And be reminded as we do that this is what life is like here and now. It's not about lasting gain. It's about enjoying the present and doing what's good and right and fitting now. Which all that is true not only for eating and drinking, it's also true for our work, which is the 4th thing that Solomon tells us then to do. He says that we should take pleasure in your work. Like, we should take pleasure in all our toil, it says in verse 13, which again, toil emphasizes the effort and struggle of whatever work we have to do in this life. Again, that's talking about more than only your job. It's talking about everything that you have to do in this life. And again, not only is work in this life a struggle, there's also no lasting gain in it. So should we just not even bother? Should we just give up and not do anything? Like, no. Like, just like eating and drinking, just because there's no lasting gain in it doesn't mean that there's no enjoyment to be found in it. And in some ways, when you stop trying to get out of it what it's not meant to give you, you can actually begin to enjoy it more for what it is. So Solomon tells us that whatever God has given us to do, we should do it. He says to take pleasure in it, which actually means, literally means to see good in it. to see good in it. Like, see whatever God has given you to do is good. Like, not every job is always the most enjoyable. There's no lasting gain in it again, but that doesn't mean that it's not good. Like, whatever you do, in some sense, is taking care of yourself, your family, serving others through the work that you're doing, and like, all that's good. Even if it's not lasting gain, it's still good. So whatever you have to do it. And take pleasure in doing it. Enjoy the work that God has given you to do. Like, that's how we should live in light of the cycles of life. And here's the thing that brings it all together. The last little phrase of verse 13. We should live like all of life is a gift from God. Because it is. Like, Solomon ends by saying, this is God's gift to man. Like, specifically referring to eating and drinking and our toil in particular, like, those are God's gift. But eating and drinking and our work in this life represent all that life is here and now. Like, the reality that all of it, every breath, every heartbeat, all the times and seasons of our lives, all the activities that make up our lives are a gift from God. And this is the perspective shift that Ecclesiastes is aiming at. Solomon wants us to stop pursuing lasting gain in this life because we'll never find it. And he wants us instead to see life as a gift. It's gift, not gain. Like, that's the key. Like, we don't have to live this life trying to take some sort of lasting gain out of it for ourselves. And we don't have to live this life trying to force the pieces of our lives together in a way that we think they ought to fit together. Because God has given us what we could never gain on our own. He's given it to us, so we don't have to take it. And he's made everything fitting and right in a way that we never could. Like, we might not be able to fully see it all here and now, but we can trust that he does. And we can live then like all of life is a gift from his hand, because it is. And so because all that's true, like, we can face the cycles of times that make up our lives, not with fear or frustration, but with encouragement and hope. And we can live this life day by day then, time by time, season by season, by being joyful, by doing good, by eating and drinking, and by finding enjoyment in all our toil in whatever time or season that God gives us. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this book, and thank you for this passage that reminds us that this is what life in this under the sun, this time that we find ourselves in here and now, this side of the fall, this is what life is like. It's a cycle of times, pluses and minuses that cancel each other out. And so the reality is there's no lasting gain to be had in anything that we do. But that doesn't leave us hopeless. It just gives us the right perspective that we ought to have on this life, that you've given us things to do, and you're at work behind all of that, making everything fitting and right in its time, even the hard things that we don't necessarily understand and can't figure out right now. You've given us enough information to be able to trust you, that you're doing something bigger than what we can see and what we can necessarily understand right now. But you're going to make it all right. You have made it all right. And so you were free to receive this life as a gift from your hands and to enjoy it, and to do what you've given us to do, and to be faithful day by day and moment by moment. Father, I pray that this passage would help us to see that, and that it would change the way that we even get up tomorrow morning, Monday morning, and go back to work and go about our day and go about our week. Father, I pray that we would live in light of this picture, this perspective on life that Solomon is giving us here. Continue to teach us from this book, Father. And through this, Lord, I pray that our hearts would be drawn ultimately to you, that we would see that the gift is meant to draw our eyes and draw our hearts back to the giver, that we're supposed to see them as beams of light from the sun, and not just enjoy their warmth, but to trace them back to their source, and to give you the praise and the glory and the thanks that you deserve as the giver of all of these good things that we get to receive and enjoy and do in this life. And so, Father, do all that in our hearts, and ultimately help us to see how all this is only possible through Jesus and through the cross, that he's the one that broke down the cycle of time that leads to death so that we can be made right with you through his death and resurrection, and eventually, ultimately spend eternity with you. I pray, Father, that our hearts would be drawn to worship him and what he's done for us, the work that he's done that makes all of this make sense. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.